Good evening, everyone. Let's get started. My apologies again for the delay in getting this event started. The only thing it means is that the 15-minute remarks that I had prepared by way of sort of the preface would now be sort of left out. We'll cut to the chase straight. The panel, as you know, is about secularism in Pakistan. We have three sort of leading experts on Pakistan and on the issue of religion and politics in South Asia generally, who will share their perspectives, and then we will open up for discussion. So the order in which we go is, I'll request Christophe to kick off. He is the most organized person because he's got a paper. Humeira has already written a book, so she doesn't need to write anything further, and so has Anatol, but Anatol has kindly agreed to go third. Christophe, over to you. So maybe if you could take about 15-20 minutes to lay out your arguments in the paper, okay, and then we'll have subsequent discussion comments. Okay, over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I have a paper that is available on the website of CERI, so I can easily give you the link, and if you want to revisit this paper, it will be easily accessible. This paper is entitled Secularization Without Secularism in Pakistan. And the starting point I use in this paper is the work of Charles Taylor on secularism and secularization. And in fact, the paper was made for a conference on Charles Taylor's Out of the West. Is Charles Taylor's study of secularization relevant out of the West, or is it something that you can only apply to Christian universities? And I begin therefore with the three notions of secularization, of three routes to secularization that Taylor identifies. The first is, of course, the most easily understandable, the evacuation of religion from the public sphere. That's secularization the way we usually understand it. The other definition he gives is a decline of beliefs and practices. Not sometimes easy to identify. When do beliefs decline? Sometimes they are just recycled, and you believe as much as you did before, but you believe in other things. But that's one of the figures of secularization that he identifies. And then he has a third interesting type of secularization, that is intellectual pluralism. When you believe in different things, when plurality of ideas is acceptable. There is not one dogma, but there is secularization because there is diversity of opinions, ideas, and that's, of course, secularization. Well, I'll use this rather at the margin of my presentation, but for adding a fourth type of secularization in the case of Pakistan. That will be my first part. But my main argument will be to contrast these secularization routes with the defeat of secularism in Pakistan. And you can have secularization of a different type without secularism. And here I refer again to Taylor, because in another book he gives a definition of secularism that I find really inspiring. He says secularism is based on two things. There must be equality between people of different faith. Of course, different faiths are legitimate in the public sphere. The main thing is that they need to be acknowledged equally. And secondly, all spiritual families must be heard. It's very simple, it's very minimal, but it's a very robust definition. Secularism, not as the French way to put it, separation between religion and the public sphere. Religions are there, plainly legitimate, but they are recognized equally. And all the groups, all the families, all the communities need to be heard. So what I'm going to do quickly is to show that try to show that in Pakistan there has been a fourth type of secularization that arcs back to Syed Ahmed Khan, and that secularization has not resulted in a long-standing secularism. And today, because I'll finish with the present-day situation, I'll end with it. One of the main challenges is probably to rehabilitate forms of secularism, forms of toleration, of diversity in the religious sphere and public sphere of Pakistan. Well, the secularization route that Sir Syed has initiated is, of course, related to the reform process. He has, with the Aligarh movement, started a reform of education and religion. It's a social-religious reform movement, but not the Western type of reform. I mean, not the kind of scientific transformation of the mind. It's not, in that sense, an evacuation of the religious. It's not the first secularity of Taylor. It's not even the second type. It's more or less the third type, plurality. The Muslim identity can be one of the viewpoints you have in the world. But I'm more interested in the fact that he's also introducing a fourth type that is different from the three previous ones, of course, and especially after it took a political turn. You may remember that in 1882 the British introduced the Local Self-Government Act that resulted for Sir Syed in a huge challenge. If democratization was taking place at the local level in British India, then the Muslims who were in a minority will have a tough time because they don't have the numbers. And they'll have to be under the thumb of Hindu municipal corporations which will regulate everything, including the slaughterhouses, which was one of the challenges. So, from that time, from 1882 onwards, Sir Syed will develop a political agenda. And we know many dimensions of it. I will focus on two. The first one is territorialization of Islam. And that means secularization indirectly. That, of course, has to do with the definition of the Muslim community as coterminous with the Urdu-speaking community, because the Hindi-Urdu controversy is unfolding itself soon after, and Sir Syed gradually, to defend the Muslim minority that is under siege, besieged by the Hindus, tend to define it as the Urdu-speaking community of the north. And therefore, that's what Fazana Sheikh says. He develops a communal agenda with a territorial dimension that therefore, of course, overshadows the universal Ummah. He is not defending the Muslims, he is defending the Muslims of North India speaking Urdu, which is already a form of secularization, because you're not in the same repertoire. And he keeps referring to land, which is a very interesting element of his discourse. Let me cite one sentence when he says, and it's very provocative in a way, just as the high caste Hindus came and settled down in this land once, forgetting where they were earlier, they considered their India as their own country. The Muslims also did exactly the same thing. They also left their clans hundreds of years ago, and they also regard this land of India as their own. It's provocative because it says, you Hindus are invaders. We too are invaders. We own a part. It's another version of the parity between Hindus and Muslims. But what is interesting is the reference to land. This is the land where you have settled down, and as Muslims, we identify with this land. But this territorialization, of course, is not at that time state-oriented in the sense that it's not an agenda for separatism. That will come later. But that will come later in the same vein. Because when Jinnah will ask for a Pakistan that will gather together or that will be built on the provinces of Punjab, North-West Frontier Province, Balochistan, Sindh and Bengal, it will also territorialize the nation, the Muslim nation. Muslims have to get identified with some land. So that's the first element of secularization that I have summarized very quickly under the name of territorialization. The other element of secularization is better captured by ethnicization. There is a form of ethnicization of Islam that you will find more in Iqbal's writings, I find. When Iqbal explains, and I quote, that Islam is not a religion in the ancient sense of the word. It's an attitude that is to say of freedom and even of defiance of universe. It is really a protest against the entire outlook of the ancient world. Briefly, it is the discovery of man. It is revolutionary. It is evolutionary and revolutionary. And it's an idea that as an ethnic component, and he says it plainly elsewhere, Muslims of India have ethnic characters in common. Muslims of India can have no objection to purely territorial electorates if provinces are so demarcated as to secure comparatively homogeneous communities possessing linguistic, racial, cultural, and religious, at the end, unity. As Muslims, of course we have a religion, but we have many other things in common, and land is one of them, language is another one. So in Islam is losing some of its ritual quality to become the identity marker of a nation in the making and in quest of some land. So we have there, of course, a territorialization and ethnicization process that goes along with secularization against, of course, the clear-cut opponents who are of two types. You have the Congress nationalists like Azad, who want a millet that is part of an ummah, the two cycles theory. And you have the fundamentalists who do not want to territorialize Islam either. They are much more faithful to the religious definition of Islam than Sir Syed, Iqbal or Jinnah, who have gone towards an ethnicization trajectory. And this trajectory is compatible with secularism, of course. Because the moment you use Islam as a marker of identity on which you will build a nation, you can also do the same with other religious groups. And that's the famous speech of Jinnah that I will not quote extensively because it is so famous that you will be bored, but you see what I mean. What I would like to quote is another thing, and it's much shorter. It is one of the objectives of the resolutions of objectives of 12 March 1949. Something that is not always mentioned, but among the 8 objectives that Liaquat Ali Khan proposes then, there is the 5th one, adequate provision shall be made for the minorities to freely profess and practice their religions and develop their cultures. Secularism. This is typically secular. Nehru will not say anything else at the same time. And there is this article in the Indian Constitution saying that you're free to profess your religion. That was a very contested, difficult argument to pass. And K. Munchy was not that happy with it. But it was passed. You can profess religion on both sides. And that's secularism, the South Asian way, saying that you're not supposed to be a religious, but everybody can be religious its own way. And that's also what you find in the first constitution, 1956, Article 18, that recognizes freedom to profess, practice, and propagate. That's exactly the Indian version. Practice, propagate any religion, and the right to establish, maintain, and manage religious institutions. 56 Constitution is not lagging behind the 1950 Constitution of India so far as secularism is concerned. No real change with Ayub Khan. I don't want to elaborate on that for the sake of time. Well, we all know that things changed just after. The 70s are really the landmark. And the Islamization policies of Bhutto first and Zia, of course, sealed the fate of secularism. You will still have secularization, of course, but without secularism for sure. And I want to dwell on this aspect because I think today we are, I would say, coping with the legacy of this turning point. When the 1973 Constitution, in its Article 2, recognizes Islam as the state religion of Pakistan, it's new. Islam was not a state religion so far. And when you look at Article 19, you see something even more different from what was there before. Freedom of speech and expression are restricted in the interest of the glory of Islam. So you see there a competition between the security of the religious majority and freedom of expression. More importantly, for the first time, non-Muslims are defined. Article 260, for the first time, makes the effort, unnecessarily, to define who is a Muslim. Nobody had tried to do it before, and Justice Munir had told everybody, don't try. Of course, because the moment you make the boundary, that neat exclusion is the most challenging thing to face. And as you all know, among the non-Muslims, for the first time, Ahmadiyyas have been bracketed together with Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, and so on. Why did Bhutto at that time choose to do it and to succumb to the pressure of the Jamaat-e-Islami that was certainly demonstrating once again against the Ahmadiyyas? They had did it in 53, they had done it again in 74. I think that's one of the research questions I'd like to investigate more, because that's a turning point for sure. And you may attribute this to the post-71 context after the creation of Bangladesh with the help of India. There is a need to regroup, to be probably more Muslim vis-a-vis the Hindu neighbor. You can also factor in Bhutto's strategy vis-a-vis Afghanistan. This is the time when he supports the Afghan Islamists, including Ahmadiyya, Haqqani father, against the Pashtun nationalists. So he's playing the Islamist card against Pashtun nationalism at that time. But this is really, for me, a kind of black box that I'd like to open and understand better, to to see whether it was purely politics or whether there were other arguments behind its term. Well, this Islamization policy continued with the same support of the Jamaat Islami under Zia. Of course, Zia in 1779 used to ask for advice to Maududi. Zia had a very ambivalent relation with the ulema and the Islamists, with a kind of love-hate relation, some of despise and at the same time reverence. But Maududi obviously could be sometimes very influential and his mentor. And he included ministers from the Jamaat Islami in his government. So again, there's no need to dwell on the reforms he introduced in education, in law, and of course in the fiscal domain with the new zakat that the Shias rejected so much. By the 80s, clearly secularism, the fate of secularism had been sealed, even though there was still some secularization, the same brands of secularization that was there before. I would say that today we are certainly at the crossroad with these two traditions, the secularist inherited from Sir Syed and Jinnah, and the Islamization or pro-Islamization attitude in competition. And I insist on this notion of competition. I think there is nothing like the end of history in Pakistan, like in the rest of the world. There is no, I would say, future that is written on the wall. And to illustrate that, I would give two sets of examples. The separate electorate issue, the separate electorate for the minorities issue. That's something that the minorities never wanted. As early as the 50s, they protested against this way of containing them. They were Hindus, they were mostly Hindus, but also Christians and others. And they said, we want to be part of the same citizenship of the West. In spite of secularism at that time, they were confined to separate electorates. Who stopped that? Musharraf, in spite of everything, and nobody has made any effort to revisit this since then. For 10 years, this has gone. Of course, Musharraf had a very vicious kind of way of putting things, but still, at least they were relieved from that. Similarly, the new government, or the one that has been elected after the last elections, has initiated a Ministry of Minorities Affairs. That was never there before. And this Ministry of Minority Affairs was, as you know, given to Shabazz Bhatti, who was a rather activist kind of Christian, someone who was able to create a federation for an association for federating the different minorities, who, by the way, represent a minuscule group these days. If you go, I should have given you these figures before. If you go by the last census, it is a bit old now, but we have no choice. You have less than 2% Christians, not more than 1.5 Hindus. Ahmadiyyas are supposed to be 0.25%. You have 300,000 Sikhs, a drop in the ocean. There is very little minority left, in fact, but they are important symbolically and not only in terms of figures. So, there have been attempts in that direction, and last reform that the government has made after 2008, in the 18th amendment that was voted in 2010, we have 10 seats given to the minorities in the National Assembly and 4 in the Senate, 1 for each province, which is more than before. So there is still the resilience of the secular tradition that we could see even before the last elections under Musharraf, when he wanted to protect himself as a modern, moderate Muslim. But still, there is at the same time the rise of intolerance on an unprecedented scale, and I would like to quickly highlight 3 points going in the same direction. The fate of the Ahmadiyyas, I'll be very quick, don't worry.
Yeah. That's good.
So the fate of the Ahmadiyyas, I would like to begin with that. Because the Ahmadiyyas, of course, after 74, has been persecuted, harassed, to say the least. And they turned to the judiciary, as citizens have to do in that case. And the High Court of Lahore, to begin with, in 78, as early as 78, did not follow them when they asked for freedom of worship. They wanted mosque and they wanted azan for calling to pray. So they turned to the Supreme Court. Especially after Zia in 1984 introduced this ordinance named Anti-Islamic Activities of the Qadiani Group, Lahori Group, and Ahmadis Prohibition and Punishment Ordinance. You know, they have many names, so you have to be sure that they would be all taken care of by the ordinance. And this prevented them from using Arab words to designate the prophet and to, of course, build mosques. They turned to the Federal Sharia Court, and the Sharia Court said, no, that's exactly the way you should be treated. They turned to the Supreme Court in 93, and that's an interesting development, because for the first time, the Supreme Court invoked the Sharia to say, yes, you are not Muslims, and you should not behave like Muslims, and you should not use Arab words, and so on and so forth. In a very interesting paper that Sadia Said has just given in Yale, where I was there during the last term, she said that she has interviewed many of the lawyers who were there in the courtroom when this decision was made. It's a major decision. For the first time, the Supreme Court invoking the Sharia as a source of law for recognizing, so to speak, non-Muslim status to the Ahmadiyyas. And the conclusion was, judges, I quote, were throughout on the defensive. They were afraid of being called pro-Ahmadiyyas. And that's, of course, the problem. Because the moment you are pro-Ahmadiyyas, you are anti-Muslim. That is especially the advocate, Bora, Fakhruddin Ibrahim, gave a very interesting testimony. Well, the fate of the Ahmadiyyas is symptomatic or symbolic of the decline of secularism, and that's something you can also see from the use of the blasphemy law in their case. We know that out of 1,060 people accused of blasphemy between 86 and 2010, 479 were Ahmadiyyas. Almost half. The other half, by the way, almost were Muslims, and the remaining 100 and so Christians. What is, of course, most worrying still is the way Ahmadiyyas have been violently attacked recently. We had in 2010 in Lahore 96 casualties of something looking like a pogrom, and they could not bury their dead except in Rabwa, where they are now more or less ghettoized. You know, you have a kind of Ahmadiyya town in Pakistan these days. And it's even more complicated because when you say you are from Rabwa, you know you will get no job because it means that you are from this community. So this is the worst case of ghettoization. It reminds me of Juapura in Ahmedabad in many ways. Except that this is a Pakka city, pure city, separate. Briefly, the Christians are not in better shape and you have all heard of the Asia Bibi case, so I don't want to dwell on that, except to say that she is one of the 180 Christians who have been also victims of this anti-blasphemy law. The number of people who are eventually condemned are not that many. But we have many cases of Christians who died in jail or were killed after getting out of jail by militants who want to make sure that the persons who make some blasphemy are condemned. Well, the story, again, and that's the point I want to highlight, is interesting because of the judiciary. The judiciary, like in the case of the Ahmadiyyas, have played current with law. Because when Zardari, in November 2010, wanted to contemplate mercy for her, the High Court of Lahore immediately issued an ordinance saying that it was not the right thing to do, and the law should take its course till its logical end. As a result, and I'll use this minute now, as a result, I don't need to repeat what happened to Salman Taseer, what happened to Shabazz Bhatti. We had a further persecution of Christians. Just one word on Hindus. The Hindus are migrating to India in larger number. There are very few, but still. Those who were left are now moving out of Pakistan in larger numbers, largely because of the kidnapping of young girls or women who are forcibly or not forcibly married to Muslims. Here the law and the lawmakers, the lawyers and the Supreme Court may be more courageous or change their mind. The Supreme Court recently identified victims of such practices and give them the choice whether to return to their family or to stay with their new husband, and they stayed with their new husband, understandably. So here we have three minorities, the back to the wall, in a situation where secularism has been completely, I would say, under attack in spite of the resilience. And that's the 3 points I want to make briefly as bullet points to conclude. We have definitely seen a secularization process resulting in a fourth type of secularization, I would say idealizations, the transformation of Islam as an ideology, and that's the Pakistan movement, which is not a religious movement, and therefore a movement open to secularism. This secularism, second conclusion, has not survived for long. It has been torpedoed by Islamization policies implemented by a civilian, Bhutto, a military ruler, Zia, almost in equal manners, or at least initially under the influence of fundamentalists, including the Jamaat Islami. Today we have both traditions in competition, with one referee that is certainly the actor we need to watch, the judiciary. The judiciary over the last few years has taken side, not the right side, in my mind. And now we wonder, with the Supreme Court being such an important actor, with Iqtidar Chaudhry such a phenomenon, is it from that side that secularism can be reinvigorated, or is that a foreclosed conclusion? I prefer to end with a question mark.
Thanks, Christophe. Humeira?
Sure. Okay, so thank you very much, Christophe, because having Christophe speak before me has in some ways made some of the things that I'm going to say perhaps a bit easier, or maybe not, because we're actually coming from very different sides to the same question. In my work previously, which has raised some amount of controversy in Pakistan and outside, there are two key ideas that I raised, two key kind of conceptual ideas, conceptual themes that underpin that work. One is to actually think about the relationship between secularization and secularism, and Christophe has very helpfully summarized some of them. But let me just say very quickly that secularization, the social process, the process that works its way through society, and secularism, either a state policy or an ideology, have been treated in social and political theory as almost separate entities. And what we don't have within social and political theory is a clear conceptual map of how the two are related. So a very basic question that is not really answered is, does a state policy of secularism lead to a social process of secularization? What comes first? Does secularization, did in Europe secularization lead to secularism, or did secularism lead to secularization? And in fact, what we have from Europe, which often serves as the model for the rest of the world to follow, even now with all post-colonial critique, under our belts nevertheless, within Europe too, there's a lot of new research, and in fact, there is no clear answer within the European context. In fact, if we look at secularization process in the European context, there were huge reversals, there were kind of lateral movements, etc. So what precisely is the relationship? We actually don't really have a clear answer. What we do have, certainly for the last decade or so, what we have had is the idea that a state-imposed state policy of secularism will lead to a process of secularization, has to lead to a process of secularization. This was the kind of general, policy prescription for most post-colonial states, but certainly for Muslim countries. So for Muslim countries, it became imperative that, secular states and secular leaders were put in place. And what the worry that this raised for me, as for many others within the context of Pakistan, is that there was a divorcing of secularism from democracy. So we had for a decade a dictatorship that was supported in political and moral terms, but also with direct financial aid. Musharraf's government received $18 billion in just military aid, and the rationale that was actually sold to populations in, say, Britain and in America was that at least he's secular. He's not democratic, we know that, but at least he's secular. So what we had, which was very worrying, was the increasing kind of separation between secularism and democracy. So within that context, I was interested in thinking through the relationship between secularization and secularism. So that's the one kind of conceptual kind of issue that I would like to raise. The second is that actually in the vast amounts of literature that we have, primarily in sociology, but increasingly also, in political science, on secularization, we actually have, if I were to summarize very broadly, we have a strand, most of our attention in academic debates and also in popular discussions has been about quantity, the quantity of religiosity. Has there been an increase in religion or a decrease? Are more people attending churches? Are more people wearing headscarves or not? Are more people wearing crosses around their necks or not? What exactly we have really focused on a kind of quantitative, we've had a very quantitative focus on religiosity. And what I argue for is a much more qualitative understanding of secularization, because secularization, starting from Weber but elsewhere as well, what we really have in terms of secularization is a fundamental change in the fabric of thought. This is the way religion is approached, the way religiosity is approached, the way religion is even conceptualized. And that qualitative process is actually just as important, or perhaps more important to my mind, than the quantitative aspect of secularization, the increase or decrease in religiosity. It's actually how we are religious, in what way are we religious, that is just as important. And so that leads me to my contention, which I raise initially tentatively in the book, and then increasingly much more assertively. I realized as I looked over my book again recently, I raise it as a question in the beginning, and then towards the end I kind of take it as a foregone conclusion, and it has raised a lot of anger in some quarters. But my contention is that, or my question is that that perhaps we can see the Islamists as facilitating a kind of secularization. So they are vehemently opposed to the policy of secularism. They don't own up to the ideology of secularism. But in fact, for some reasons that I shall discuss very quickly, we see them as facilitating a kind of secularization, a secularization that is primarily a kind of objectification, homogenization of religious belief, and a secularization in terms of an increasing debate and critical engagement with what it means to be a good Muslim today. So in the context of Pakistan, this is a debate that has really taken on over the last 30 years. You see a fundamental change where there's a lot more questioning, and you will hear actually, as I did my ethnographic work, and also I spend a lot of time in Pakistan, you hear very frequently the idea that our parents didn't have to think about, or at some, not so distant past, point in the past, people didn't really have to think about religion, but now we have to constantly think about what it means to be a good Muslim, what are the various ways in which to be a good Muslim. And there's a lot more critical engagement with what Islam means, what it means to be a good Muslim, and given the plethora of ways in which you can be a good Muslim, there's a critical engagement with the very kind of definition of religion and religiosity. So how exactly are the Islamists facilitating secularization? Because to raise that question is to recognize, it seems implausible, it seems counterintuitive in many ways. The first thing I think to say is that the very structure of Islamist thought is modernist, in the sense that Islamists, so if you look at a party like Jamaat-e-Islami, one of the questions that hasn't been asked in the debates that we've had about Islamism is why exactly does Islamism arise at the precise historical moment that it does arise in? So why exactly late 19th, early 20th century? What is it about that moment in history that Islam, this particular variation of Islam, because Islam and Islamism are not the same things. Islamism is that particular strand of Muslim revivalism that is focused very much on taking over the state. And to my mind, Islamism arises in Egypt, in South Asia, at that particular moment, because the state becomes a very important idea. The state is the idea that fuels emancipatory mobilizations of all kinds, the various kinds of revolutionary and political mobilization. So from liberal nationalism to fascism, to communism, to socialism, the state, the idea is, early 20th century, that you take over the state to transform society. And what people like Maududi, who actually is not a religious scholar in the tradition, he's not an alim, he's actually looked down upon by various ulama, he's a journalist by tradition. So Maududi actually takes up this idea that, in fact, yes, we take over the state and transform society, but he translates into an Islamic idiom. And I often joke, and it actually offends people for different reasons, but I often say that Jamaat-e-Islami is in many ways the best Leninist party in Pakistan, even today, although it's kind of losing that edge. But actually, Maududi took the Leninist model, the cadre-based system where you work for many years as an activist, then you're inducted into, you become a member or a rukn, and then you work your way through and become a member of the Shura, which is the central committee. So it's really a Leninist model that he took and kind of translated into an Islamic idiom. But more than the kind of organizational strategies, etc., the structure, when I say the structure of Islamist thought is modernist, what I'm also referring to is the kind of concepts, the kind of ideas that Maududi engages with, and also the view of history that Maududi comes to and comes with is modernist in the sense of having a linear view of history, moving towards a kind of progressive history in many ways, and an attempt at, so what exactly Maududi and to some extent Wahhabism's main attempt is at erasing contradictions. So looking at religion as a kind of trying to define religion as a coherent whole from within which you actually try to erase contradictions. So this constant effort at thinking through if we do this, if we say that only one God is to be worshipped, then Sufi saints and actually worshipping at the shrines of Sufi saints, that should not be Islamic. So that, okay, even though this is a cultural practice, millions of Muslims do this, but logically this is not rational that we should do this, so we take it out. And so these are the kinds of ideas that Maududi and Islamists increasingly started playing with, trying to eradicate internal contradictions and to make religion a kind of coherent, rational whole. So that's the structure, and that's deeply problematic because social life actually is structured around various kind of contradictions, various logical and rational contradictions actually make social and political life possible. So this attempt is in some ways, bound to failure, but nevertheless, this is an attempt that the Islamists actually undertook with huge enthusiasm. The other key thing that I highlight in my work is that we often think about, and particularly in terms of media representations, Islamists are presented as if this one big happy family which is kind of sharing goals and moving along smoothly. But in fact, there's intense competition. There is intense rivalry amongst the Islamists. So this thought that somehow all religious forces are together, and then, okay, maybe not all religious forces, but certainly the Islamists, they share goals, they probably just want to do the same thing, so they are one force and we are all pitted against them. But in fact, the Islamists are deeply riven with, and so in terms of, in my field work, and I carried out 13 months of ethnographic field work with two members of, and lower rung activists of Jamaat-e-Islami and Jamaat-ul-Dawa, two Islamist parties in Pakistan. And I really wanted to focus on the lower rung activists because, in fact, the leaders have been interviewed to death. They have pat answers to questions, any question that you may want to ask. And they also say things like, I'm meeting with the World Bank delegate at 12, so if you want to come see, and I'm seeing, BBC's journalist XYZ at 12:30. So if you want to come see me, it has to be between 12:45 and 1:15. So we have interviewed the leaders, but how exactly do lower level activists make sense of what the leaders say? How does it make sense in their everyday lives? What difference has it made in their everyday lives? So these were some of the things I was interested in finding out. And as I did that, I realized that there is intense competition for constituency amongst, say, Jamaat-e-Islami and Jamaat-ul-Dawa, for instance, but also other kinds of Muslim revivalist groups like the Tablighi Jamaat, which is not an Islamist party. It's a pietist group. It doesn't want to take over the state. They're trying to attract the same pool of people within urban Pakistan, lower middle class, recent immigrants to cities, often immigrants from either smaller towns or villages, people who may have socially conservative norms that they bring to the cities, and they are really trying to attract a similar pool. They're trying to actually get people from one to into their organization. And what is interesting is how promiscuous, in some ways, the activists too are.
Sorry to stop you. I've got to run because of childcare, but this is hugely important, more so because elections are around the corner in Pakistan. And I just wanted to throw something in the mix because I'm very Punjabi like that. But Pakistan seems to be cannibalizing itself at a very rapid pace. And part of that is the Islamic context, and some of that will start to unravel. That's hugely important to the diaspora living outside of Pakistan and understanding the impact of that on 180 million people, not from just a political state, a judiciary point of view, but the state's well-being. So that's something I would like to pick up with you at a later stage, but I thought I'd throw it out there, and I do apologize for that first one. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's always good to have a question you don't have to answer.
Exactly. Thank you.
So how much time do I have?
About 3 minutes or so.
Oh, 3 minutes, okay.
I think we need to.
So actually what is quite interesting is that the activists are also quite promiscuous. They move from one group to the other. It's not a lifelong loyalty, membership, or there are some like that too. But they also move from one to the other. And I found people discussing and debating a whole range of things, from whether, say if you look at parda for women, there's a whole range of options. You can wear generally modest clothes that cover your arms and legs, etc. Or you can wear a dupatta on top. Or you can wear a chadar, which would be bigger. Or you can wear a hijab and a chadar. Or you can wear a niqab that also covers your face. And actually you see the full range being practiced. You see people wearing this or that. And then also debating whether a sleeveless shirt is enough, or whether you need to do the full spectrum thing of niqab, hijab and chadar, etc. But given these kinds of various options that are possible just for everyday religiosity, but also in terms of political strategy. So JD, Jamaat-ul-Dawa activists, were constantly making fun of Jamaat-e-Islami activists in terms of how they've now, in local body elections at that time, formed alliances with PPP, are doing things with former opponents, and because they're playing on the pitch of democracy, they've lost the moral kind of high ground. So there's a questioning of political strategies, there's a questioning of religious credentials, there's a questioning of the very fundamental approach to religion, which is quite central to urban Pakistan now. And given the impact that groups like Jamaat-e-Islami, much beyond their strength, were able to have during the Zia years, actually this is a conversation that most urban Pakistanis have to have, not because they're interested in Islam, but because Islam became the kind of cultural prism through which most activities were being understood. But that has had a dual effect of also constantly then trying to understand, define and question Islam as well. So I think, very briefly, given that I have only half a minute maybe, I want to just very quickly pick on something that Christophe led us towards the end, which was the question of Ahmadiyya and minorities. And I think, again, what is quite interesting, if we think about secularism not as separation of church and state or religion and state, but Dalal Asad's definition, which I find really productive, is actually the management of religion by the state. And so Asad, for instance, points out that even in the European context, what we don't say in Britain today, we don't have a separation of church and state. What we have is the management of church by the state. The state increasingly took on the functions in the European context and elsewhere as well that churches used to provide, of healthcare, of education, etc. So that has all been taken over by the state, but also the state increasingly manages religious thought and practice. And in the process actually generates new forms of religion. So if we take that definition of secularism, and we think about how the Pakistani state has managed religion over the last, since its inception, the inception of the country, one of the things that really strikes you is that the state is not anxious about the minorities. The state is most anxious about attempting to create a majority. The state had the most of the legislation, the most oppressive kind of focus has actually been on trying to define a Muslim. What is a Muslim? How do we manage different kinds of Muslims? And Ahmadiyya are interesting precisely because they have been taken out of the kind of vast, hugely heterogeneous, every time around 5 I start losing my English and I revert to Punjabi. This vast teeming kind of group of different kinds of Muslims that became part of Pakistan, the state has actually used Ahmadiyya as an easy kind of, also because the Ahmadiyya initially used to kind of separate themselves out of the kind of Muslim identity. They declared themselves as, they wanted to be called Ahmadiyya in the 1901 census, separate from the Muslims category that had been created. So the state actually used the Ahmadiyya as a group to increasingly try and regulate what other Muslims would look like. And so the state's anxiety is not about Christians, not about Hindus, not about the Sikhs in Pakistan. The state's anxiety is precisely about Muslim. Who is the Muslim citizen? How do we create a Muslim citizen that is no longer Sindhi, Punjabi, no longer upper class, lower class, Jagirdar, peasant, landlord, etc. That's been fundamental to the state's anxiety. So that is much more than my half minute. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we can take that conversation further in the questions.
Okay, thanks, Humeira.
Thank you very much.
That is very useful. Anatol, you have all of 5 minutes to.
Oh my God! Sorry.
Go on. I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes.
I won't talk for too long. I expected, of course, Christophe and Humeira to cover this brilliantly, which they did. So I thought, by way of saying something a little different, more interesting, I would try to put the struggles of Pakistani secularism, which, as we've heard, doesn't really exist in any significant sense, and secularity in Taylor's sense, which does, in a wider historical and international context, including Europe and other parts of the Muslim world. And then, having done that, I thought I'd briefly say something about the relationship between religion and nationalism, particularly as regards the institution which embodies, or at least thinks it embodies, whatever there is of Pakistani nationalism, namely the army. Just briefly, though, to start with, as Christophe mentioned, it is always worth, in this context, just briefly pointing out that, of course, the disenchantment of the world, which for so long was taken as basically the norm for modern development and progress, outside Europe either does not appear to be the case, or at least is highly qualified. Now, to say that is almost a cliche, but it's still worth saying it, because, as Christophe said, it has sunk pretty deeply into the consciousness of academia in particular, and it does create this unconscious attitude that everything that doesn't conform to this has, in a sense, to be explained away by false consciousness, by manipulation, because it's odd, it's aberrant in some way. Now, of course, from that point of view, to talk about the West as embodying the disenchantment of the world is itself profoundly wrong. The first part of this lecture will be about America. Whether, because how good the parallels or useful the comparisons are, I don't know. It's basically because I've spent most of my time recently thinking about religion in America and not in Pakistan. But anyway, clearly America is a country where both there is still very strong, both extensive in terms of quantity and intensive in terms of practice, religious belief and faith, and where religion plays a very important part in politics, as I would say is inevitable. Where religion is essentially unified and uncontested, it will permeate communal and public ritual, life in general, practice, in a way that's generally accepted and non-controversial. Where it faces challenges, it is bound to find a political expression in order to resist these challenges or in order to assert itself. Now, if you look at, compare the United States and Europe in this regard, and also the American evangelical churches, which grew up not necessarily firstly in America, but then greatly developed in America, and contrast them with the American churches which were derived from Europe, I think it is possible, in part, to explain the decline of religion in Europe by the fact, of course, that historically European religion has been highly organised, highly monolithic, and highly hierarchical, and intimately associated with state and social hierarchies. And therefore, the revolt against religion in Europe was part of the revolt against the Ancien regime in general. Now, in America, of course, it's quite different. The evangelical churches themselves grew up in very intimate association with rebellion against the previous hierarchies and the previous colonial state. And they are, of course, the ultimate decentralized churches. I mean, to put it in a nutshell, because the Catholic Church, which is the ultimate centralized and hierarchical church, is centralized and hierarchical, any extensive abuses, even at a lower level, discredit the institution as a whole. They ultimately come home to roost with the Pope himself. You can't do that with American evangelical churches because, of course, if one American preacher discredits himself in some way, which they have a tendency to do quite often, the congregation simply leaves and joins another preacher, another church. Now this, of course, is Sunni Islam to the life, in many ways. In the first place, it is extremely decentralized. It cannot be discredited as a whole by the sins of particular preachers or clerics. The second thing, of course, is that although not historically anti-establishment in the same way as the American evangelical churches, it has historically nonetheless a very considerable element of distance from state authorities and social hierarchies, and this has been greatly increased as a result of the moves of elites in various countries to a greater or lesser degree of westernization during and since colonial days. And in America too, of course, you see in the evangelical churches a very strong relationship between class resentments, but class resentments rendered in cultural and not economic terms, but nonetheless bitterly felt class resentments against the elites, strongly associated with a particular form of nationalism. The accusation that the American elites are, intellectual and cultural elites, are in particular, of course, if you'll forgive me, Christophe, Frenchified. And therefore, of course, are not just atheists and decadent, but are also potential traitors to the nation, has been a theme of evangelical churches and church politics in America going back for 200 years or more. And the other interesting thing about, if you look at America, is that in certain respects, the religiosity of American public life and the intensity of some of these attitudes has got more so over time and not less. It's often remarked that Jefferson and Lincoln perhaps could not be elected in America today given their public attitudes. So you have, I think, certain similarities here in terms of the way in which these religious attitudes embody a range of other beliefs, resentments, identities. And of course, from this point of view as well, one can see that the distinction between religion as religion and religion as culture, including regional culture, class culture, is an extremely blurred one, very often. One shouldn't get into the business of, I find the whole idea of false consciousness profoundly misleading, but certainly one can see ways in which religion becomes a flag or banner to express other identities, other resentments, and so on. And on the other hand, of course, in America, America exemplifies a religious country which is, however, secular in Taylor's terms, in that it is absolutely embodied in the American tradition that you have to treat all religions alike. Religion is of great importance, but you have to treat them all alike. Except, of course, if you know American history, that in many ways it isn't. I do not wish, as you can well imagine, to sound like a member of the Christian right in the United States, a force with whom I've had considerable differences in my time. But they do have a historical point when they say that for a large part of American history, America was in effect a Protestant nation in which all Protestant churches were treated alike, but others were not. And in particular, the ones who were not were the ones who claimed to be Christian, while in the view of the Protestant majority, actually having broken away to espouse something very different and deny or qualify or extend the essential truths of Christianity. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Mormons. The Mormons were faced with savage, public, not state, of course, but, well, even state to a degree, though on certain aspects of practice, but certainly savage public persecution for several decades, something which is still sunk in Mormon consciousness. And indeed, there were considerable questions when Romney was standing for election, whether this belief, which is still very strong, by the way, in evangelical churches, that the Mormons are not Christians and therefore are, in a sense, excluded from their vision of the national community, would not considerably sap his vote in the natural Republican white conservative constituency. I don't think it did very much, but it's interesting that the question was raised. Together with this, once again, in America, goes this very strong identification between this form of religion, as I say, embodying certain class attitudes, regional attitudes, and so forth, with American nationalism. Now that, of course, brings me to the second part of my remarks, which is that in America, as remarked by Tocqueville, nationalism really can be seen as something which emerged from the popular consciousness, from below. Elsewhere, hardly an original thought, especially in many parts of Europe, but also much of the rest of the world, and particularly the Muslim world, nationalism is something which had to be instilled from above by elites. The essential theme of much of Gramsci's work. And this nationalism in France to a degree, but also Germany, very marked indeed in Italy and other places. This nationalism instilled from above was closely related with wider liberal projects, including liberal projects of secularization, directed against the former, or the still existing, religious traditions and religious institutions, for two reasons. One being that it was felt that these religious institutions had wider allegiances, which qualified allegiance to the nation. Secondly, of course, they were tied up with the Ancien Regime, authorities and classes, which the liberal middle classes were dedicated to overthrowing. But finally, of course, they were seen as obstacles to the liberal project of progress. Progress as an absolute good, but also progress for the nation. And you can, of course, see considerable echoes of this in Ayub Khan's, what he wanted to do, much, much weaker with Musharraf. And I think myself that if Jinnah had lived, he would have tried to follow a very similar thing in terms, of course, of modernising and strengthening the nation. And therefore you have to push back against at least certain kinds of religion, because on the whole the liberals tried to make certain compromises with religions. Now, of course, locus classicus of this in the Muslim world, a figure, an ideology which has been used by every subsequent figure, including in Pakistan, who has tried to adopt such a program, is Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, and Kemalism. Now, as it has turned out, of course, in recent years, in the longer term, Kemalism was much less successful than it thought it was, and both the religious belief, but its expression in politics, has come back. Nonetheless, you can see that in the intervening decades, Turkey was transformed to a very considerable extent, certainly to an extent, alas, that can be hardly dreamed of in Pakistan as yet. And how was Atatürk able to do this? And this brings me back again to the liberals in Europe and to the question of this kind of modernisation and secularisation and democracy, which Humeira has raised. Because most unfortunately, and it is unfortunate, it is even in many ways tragic, the liberal project in countries where the mass of the population remains deeply religious has not been, and indeed cannot be, a democratic one, by definition. Because frankly, you're trying to do to the mass of the population something that it doesn't like. You have elites trying to change the population from above. What do you need in order to do this? I'm talking here about secularism in the stricter sense, in the Kemalist or traditional European sense. What do you need to do this? You need nationalism, and you don't just need nationalism, but you need victorious nationalism. You need victory. Fascinating from this point of view to compare the programs, which are in many ways very, very similar, of Ataturk in Turkey and the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. Ataturk succeeded. The Pahlavis, well, they modernized their country to a degree, but they, of course, themselves ultimately failed and were succeeded by a semi-theocratic regime. What's the difference? I would say the difference is that Ataturk won his victories. He defeated his Western and other enemies. He savagely, of course, defeated his internal ethnic enemies, whereas in the end, the Shahs of Iran were obviously Western puppets, first British and then American. They could not mobilize nationalism. You cannot mobilize nationalism on the strength of national humiliation and national defeat. Well, that, of course, does bring one to poor old Pakistan, in a way. Pakistan has been defeated a number of times. Its elites are widely perceived by a large part of the population to be in the pocket of the Americans. And, of course, equally importantly, compared to Turkey or Iran or Italy, even Italy, like how Italy is, Pakistan is not an ethnic nation. You cannot mobilize ethnic nationalism against religion in this way. So what are you left with, very briefly? Well, I think you are left with perhaps more secularity than has altogether come out today. I mentioned perhaps, or implied, a comparison between the Ahmadiyya and the Mormons. Neither of my colleagues, however, has yet mentioned the word Shia, or directly, of course, within the Sunni community, insofar as even this makes much sense as far as certain of its elements are concerned. The whole Barelvi, Deobandi, Ali Hadith distinction, and the fact that once you come to the worship of the shrines, of course, which is still of less importance, but still of great importance, including political importance, in large parts of the countryside, and, yes, in some of the towns as well. Here you have institutions which, in fact, bridge the Sunni-Shia divide to a considerable extent. Then, of course, there's the fact we don't know how many Shia there are, given that, as we all know, there are very great Shia families with very famous names, who, of course, practice taqiyya. Everybody knows they're Shia, but they never actually say it themselves. And the way round that is to stress adherence to shrines in many parts of the country. Here, you do still have, when it comes to trying to treat, and first of all, of course, one should say that there are, as we see headlines, alas, every week now, there are attempts by extreme sectarian groups in certain, but only certain, limited sections of the Islamists, not shared by all the Islamists by any manner of means, attacks on the Shia, which are every bit as physically ferocious and hateful as the attacks on the Ahmadis. Now this, of course, you have political parties which play with this in certain areas, less, I think, from conviction in many cases than from pure cynicism and cowardice, of course, as well. But the Pakistani state as a whole, and certainly the army, has not abandoned secularity when it comes to treating the main Muslim sects or faiths alike. In this sense, you could say that there is a certain resemblance still between Pakistan and India. Indian secularity, you treat all religions alike. In Pakistan, you do the same. You treat all religions alike as long as they're Islamic. Which is a bad joke, but it's a joke with an element of truth because there are so many different kinds of Islam. Where does that leave the secularity project? not the secularism project. And once again, I mean, looking at in its relationship to nationalism. And Pakistani nationalism was understood by the army, but also to a degree the kind of middle classes, Punjabi middle classes, who do on the whole still staff the officer corps. Well, you have Islam, you have the profound ambiguity, of course, of, on the one hand, stressing Islam as a unifier, but in circumstances where any attempt to make that official, as under Zia, only increases sectarian differences. So you can only have Islam as a unifier as long as it remains a very weak and, not weak, it can be very strongly expressed, but it has to be very diffuse in terms of detail if Islam is to be a unifier in this sense. Interesting from that point of view that there was a considerable backlash within the army against some of Zia's Islamizing moves within the army itself. For example, the encouragement of the Tablighi Jamaat to preach within the army, precisely because it was felt that this was risk doing what the army absolutely dreads, which is dividing the army, creating alternative allegiances within the army, dividing people along sectarian lines. So you have this element of of on the one hand trying to, of course, stress Islam as the critical element of Pakistani nationalism, but by the same token having to back away from codifying it. Of course, an additional sort of side thing here, it was the repeated attempt in Afghanistan and then in Kashmir and India to use Islam as a weapon. But in the process, of course, mobilizing, funding, arming groups which were not, on the whole, explicitly sectarian when they started, but which, of course, have in some cases become allied with sectarian forces and therefore, once again, divide the country internally. Finally, and very briefly, there is the desire, the wish. This is something that a recent PhD thesis by Amara Maqsood, who you may know, about modernity and Islam in the Lahore middle classes, has explored rather interestingly. This wish to make Islam compatible with certain basic kinds of modernization, and modernization as far as, because this is also where, of course, we're trying to see modernization as not westernization. In other words, trying to see the improvement of social life and the economy as something which we can do without simply aping the West, but which nonetheless will lead to better hospitals, better healthcare, better public standards, better roads, all these things. From that point of view, I've often myself felt, talking to Pakistani officers about their vision of Islam, I've often been reminded something that Lytton Strachey said about Florence Nightingale, herself, of course, an army nurse. She felt towards him, meaning God, as she might towards a glorified sanitary engineer. And in some of her speculations, Miss Nightingale hardly seems to distinguish between the deity and the drains. In other words, the desire to create a kind of Islam that will turn the Pakistani cities into cantonments in which everyone will be neat and tidy and collect the rubbish, and and everything will be in straight lines and so forth. This is also there, and interestingly, there is this desire, as I say, more widely in the middle classes. So, I don't know where that leads us. What I suppose I'm trying to say is that and by the way, this identification of the deity in the drains can also occasionally be found talking to people in, not of course in the Pakistani Taliban, but certainly in some of the activists of Jamaat ud-Dawa and Jamaat Islami as well. So I suppose what I'm saying is that terrible in so many ways the situation is in Pakistan from the the point of view of religious hatred and the failure of secularism. It is, I think, still, it's getting awfully late, but it is still perhaps premature to write off secularity in a wider sense as a possible force for the transformation of the country in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anatol. Okay, so I think we've got lots of ideas to discuss, so the floor is open. Please identify yourself and let us know who the question is addressed to. Is it all right if we collected a few questions and then went around the table once and then maybe we could do another one, depending on how much? Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Sure. I was just going to say, yeah, thanks. And I agree with just on Humeira's point about, they agree about the difference between distinguishing between the project and the outcome, and also about what you were describing about religion becoming seen as an objectified particular cult and all of that. I just don't really, I'm not trying to be pedantic, but I honestly don't get why you're using the word secularization and not rationalization, objectification, modernization, even Protestantization. Because, I mean, like, if you go back to Taylor's criteria, for example, which Christophe mentioned, I mean, we're not seeing an evacuation of religion from the public sphere, even if the whole kind of old Madudius state project is gone. We're not seeing a decline of practices or beliefs on an individual level, and we're not, I mean, pluralism of ideas, sure, is the acknowledgement is that, but then it's been around since, Syed Ahmed Khan was denounced as the Nachari or whatever, and we're not really, I mean, maybe this will happen somehow, but not yet seeing an acceptance of pluralism necessarily. So I'm just wondering about the use of the word, and like Anatol was saying at the end, like secularity, well, kind of why, I mean, what distinguishes when you say secularity, why not pragmatism or?
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, what's secular about secularization?
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Yeah, my question to you, my name is Raghavan, and I've been working on some foreign office projects in Pakistan, mainly around counter-extremism and interfaith harmony. And based on my working experience in Pakistan over the last 3 years, I have interacted with the religious leaders and the community leaders and the young people especially. And what I found out is that not only the general public, but when you even speak to the intellectual class and you just say the word secularization or secularism, the emotional flow and the anger and the misconception that whether you started talking against Islam, so this perception mainly, how can we work towards removing this perception, and also what is the scope of secularization in general in the Pakistani environment? Secondly, like you mentioned about divorcing secularization from democracy, how can we work towards its remarriage?
Yep. Let me take one more question and then.
My name is Jaffrelot from SOAS. Many of the questions are for Christophe Jaffrelot. I agree. The first one is Olivism seems to make a divide between secularism and religion. And this is a very Western divide. And how could you go, for example, in defining Islam as Massignon, as a secular theocracy? And being what Pakistan is today, we're talking about the 1949 resolution and freedom of religion. In the 1949 resolution, it also says that sovereignty does not lie within the nation, lies with God. As such, legally speaking, and this is more of a legal standpoint, Pakistan is an Islamic state. Now it comes to, within this Islamic state, what are the institutions? How do you modernize Islam? This was, in Egypt, for example, someone like Sanhuri tried to have a model for this. How does it start? How does it fail? Last question concerning the Afghans and their place. Of course, when you're an Islamic state, or when Islam is a state religion, the state will have to define Islam at one point, because he is the sovereign and he has to do so.
Can you say it again? Sorry, can you repeat this question?
when you're in an Islamic state, the logic of an Islamic state, and some Pakistani lawyers, for example, have written about this, the logic is that you have to allow us to define religion. It's our duty. Not as in a secular state as in India, where religion will be defined by the communities themselves, which is the step taken by India. In this case, you were talking about the Ahmadiyas, and the position of the Pakistani courts, which is, by the way, the same as the UK courts when it comes to refugee status, is that it's not the Ahmadiyas which are being persecuted, it's the Ahmadi religion. And that makes a difference between, again, the private and public sphere. Of course, as it comes to social and policy and other things, but legally speaking, you're not persecuting the Ahmadiyas, you're still allowing them in private to practice the religion. What you're forbidding, as an Islamic state, is the public. And this is also important, as I said, in the UK, when you come Ahmadiyya and when you apply for refugee status, this is what the UK courts are going to tell you. Are you a practicing Ahmadi? Because being Ahmadi is not enough.
Okay, thanks. Christophe, do you want to start off by responding? Then we can do one quick round of responses and then we'll collect some other questions.
The questions are fresh in our minds, so it's easier. These three questions. I've been misunderstood on the first point. I'm precisely saying that secularism is not against religion. It's precisely the acknowledgement that religions, in the plural, are all legitimate on the public sphere. And that's where it is so different from the French or the Turkish laicity, because that's the quality of secularism to recognize every religion in the public sphere on the same footing. And that's what is at stake: plurality, diversity, and recognition of this diversity publicly. You're right, so far as the objectives resolution is concerned. There is a real tension there between the room that is made to the minorities, the citizenships, forms of citizenship, and the sovereignty that is supposed to be there in the prophet himself. There is this tension because it's a compromise. It's a compromise between different positions, and it was clearly one of the reasons for the tension I've kept mentioning, and it is still there. And I agree with Anatol. We can't say that the game is over. The tension is still there. It was consubstantial to the country, but it was there even before partition. It was there even when you have the Jamaat Islami on the one hand and the Muslim League on the other hand. On the third question, well, that's precisely the point. We do want Ahmadiyyas to be able to practice the religion publicly. Of course, you can be anything privately, but the main problem is to be able to be, well, faithful to your religion publicly. And that's what secularism is about. And this is exactly the challenge on the Indian side as well. The Hindutva agenda is you can certainly be a Muslim privately, you can certainly be a Christian privately, but you have to pay allegiance to Hindu symbols publicly. And that's precisely what is at stake. And probably you can be legalistic and say, well, are you a practicing Ahmadiyya? Well, an Ahmadiyya who does not practice sometimes don't practice because it cannot practice. Plus, you have this problem of ID. If you have to put your name on your origin on the ID, you're of course immediately stigmatized. I wanted to add something. Sorry, and that slipped out of my mind. Yes, the question of why do you need to define who is a Muslim? It's not only because it's an Islamic state. It's also because it is said somewhere the chief of the executive has to be a Muslim. The moment the chief of the executive has to be a Muslim, you have to know who is a Muslim. So you can postpone the definition, but at one point of time you may have to decide whether this man is or not a Muslim. And if I was provocative, I would say one day the question will be, is he a Sunni?
Yes, okay. So, to start with the first question. So why secularization? Why not some of the other ways in which we could talk about this change? I think the reason why I came to this partly was your research is contingent on many things, and how you frame things is also contingent, obviously. I mean, we all like to think that this is the most objective way of defining, and we try to, but nevertheless, so one of the things that I was reading at the same time as I was carrying out my research was literature on secularization. And this strand of, or this definition of secularization as disenchantment, as objectification, was actually a very important strand of the first kind of wave of literature on secularization. So when we have with Weber the whole idea of the transformation in Protestant religiosity, the transformation that happens in Christianity with the rise of a kind of Protestant way of thinking and looking at world, that actually is the foundational text of the literature on secularization. And yet, over time, that focus on the changes in the texture of religiosity, the qualitative aspects of religious practice and ideas, that focus shifted away. So in a sense, I was just kind of staying with some of the literature that I had read. But in fact, now that I think about it, the other advantage, especially since the book has come out and it has generated a lot of debate and vociferous debate in some ways, there is a political advantage to it, I think, as well. And the political advantage is that terms like secularization have been very firmly placed within a kind of a black box that we call progressive things. We can call progressive stuff, democracy, women's rights, etc., etc. And secularization is part of that black box. But actually, what really is the relationship between secularization and various kinds of progressive projects and democracy, etc., a lot of that needs to be thought through. And as Anatol spoke about, not just the American context, but also within the European context, secularization has not been an unmitigated good. There are immense problems with secularization that I haven't really discussed here, but we tend to think about secularization as this good thing that we cannot associate it with Islamists, which are bad. And so, in fact, the fact that thinking about the kinds of changes that Islamists are bringing about, the fact that how we have defined secularization, how secularization is understood in an important stream of academic literature, but also in public discourse, that juxtaposition, I think, is quite useful both analytically and politically to actually allow us to think about some of the important conceptual gaps that we still have. The question of, and that leads into, I guess, the question of democracy and secularization. Now, one of the things that I'm struck with every time we discuss Pakistan, especially now over the last few years, is that we tend to increasingly, and I don't know why, but it's interesting how increasingly Pakistan at one level is being grouped as AFPAC, as part of the kind of theater of war that is going on in Afghanistan. And yet at the same level, we talk about Pakistan as if many of these developments are logical conclusions of what was going on in Pakistan, since time immemorial, or since time Pakistan was founded. So in fact, there are, again, various contingent developments that have allowed and exacerbated certain kinds of trends within Pakistani social and political scenarios, within Pakistani social and political development. So if I look back to, say, 10, 12 years back, before the war in Afghanistan started, actually the large Islamist groups were increasingly finding it hard to actually stay true to their original version of taking over the state, etc. They had really started diversifying. Even groups like Jamaat-ul-Dawa were finding it hard to stay within the kind of militant mold. They were looking at other kinds of strategies. They were increasingly going into either diluting their ideology, going into social services, expanding into groups that they hadn't engaged with in the past, in some ways internally democratizing as well, within certain limits. So it's not that they were going to turn, into model citizens of the progressive kind, but they were actually going through various changes. The war in Afghanistan has actually been the worst possible damaging, the one single thing that has damaged secularization in Pakistan in the most profound way, and yet we have these conversations about Pakistan, secularism, secularization, as if the war is not taking place. So groups like Jamaat-ud-Dawa became conduits for weapons. They had increasingly their militant wings, which were kind of dying out, then had raison d'etre for continued operations. They were provided with, and because arms and drugs start flowing every time there's a war of the kind that is going on in Afghanistan right now, arms and drugs start flowing through, and they need these kinds of semi-clandestine kind of bodies to operate through. So there's a way in which the story in Pakistan cannot be divorced from the story in Afghanistan right now. And so I think that is one important thing to keep in mind. But keeping that aside for a while, so what kind of a citizen will the secularization that, say, Jamaat-Islami and Jamaat-ud-Dawa were facilitating, albeit inadvertently, what kind of a citizen are they likely to produce? And I think the first thing to obviously think about is that even though there is that parallel with Europe, with the Protestant, so Anatol mentioned that the Catholic Church, nowhere in history do we have as structured a church, as hierarchical, with as much control over social and political processes as we did in Europe at a particular point. So we don't really have a clear parallel to that. And we can't really replicate. So if secularization happens in Pakistan, even if we were to call it Protestantization, etc., it is similar but not the same thing. It will actually create a very different kind of citizen. And that really is partly what I'm investigating now. And I've written recently, I just edited a special issue of a journal on secularism and citizenship. And of course, places like Israel and Pakistan are really interesting because they are both going through very similar kinds of fragmentation in terms of their citizenry and the need to actually have a religious explanation for how and what the citizenship, what kind of selfhood will be created. So there are interesting parallels, but I don't think that we can have a very clear answer of the kind of citizen that the secularization of Jamaat-Islami would have created. We do know that it would not be the kind that was created in Europe. That's the kind of short answer that I can give. But exactly what kind of citizen, I think, needs to be investigated in some more detail.
Okay. Anatol, any particular point that you want to say?
Very briefly on sovereignty. I'm not sure that the phrase itself is a key problem. I think if you boiled, well, of course we don't have a constitution in Britain, but I think if you boiled Britain down to its ultimate bottom line, you'd find that God is actually sovereign in Britain, in that Her Majesty, the Queen, is sovereign, and she is, of course, Queen by the grace of Almighty God. Until the First World War, many European countries were ruled by monarchs by the grace of Almighty God. It didn't stop them from, in most respects, modernising their societies. The problem is, of course, Islam, when you get into, comparatively speaking, very detailed legal texts, with specific recommendations for the regulation of society and so forth. But what I'm saying is that I don't think you should begin by going after the sovereignty issue. That's beginning at the wrong end. Now, on democracy and secularization and nationalism, well, I talked about the past, but if you look at Egypt today, this is a profound question, and many of you may have come across this exchange between Kenneth Roth and some feminist critics in particular. And they were saying basically, the hell with democracy. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood has been elected. Yes, the Salafis came second, but it doesn't matter. They're wrong. So we are better people. We have the right ideas. We should decide. Well, the end result of that is what happened in Algeria in the 1990s. If you're going to take that line, you have to be prepared, as some you might say in French, to go vagant, to be prepared to exercise savage repression to the end, and that's not possible in Pakistan. So, and what Humeira said about the impact of the Afghan war is, I think, also extremely important, above all when it comes to the nationalist element. If, as unfortunately has, and I think this came out very much from your remarks as well, the phrase, the word secularization has become deeply, deeply associated with the idea of westernization. The fact that the overwhelming mass of the Pakistani population is so bitterly opposed to American policy in particular is a very, very serious disadvantage. So frankly, of course, we must talk about these concepts in academia and intellectual discussion in order to broaden and deepen our understanding of concepts and historical background. But frankly, if I were trying to get something done in Pakistan, I would not use this word at all. I just wouldn't use it. I'd talk, you mentioned the word pragmatism, I would talk about practical things. I would talk about economic development. I would talk about women's education. I would talk about health. And of course there is perhaps more of an overlap than is often thought. It's rather striking that Jamaat Islami, Jamaat al-Dawa activists, and interestingly enough, Abdul Rashid Ghazi in the Red Mosque I interviewed shortly before he was killed, all talked about their admiration for the Iranian system. They do this in part to distinguish themselves from the Taliban and, of course, the Pakistani Taliban. In other words, we are not mountain savages. There's a lot of that behind this as well. We don't believe in cutting women's noses off. We don't believe in any of this. We don't believe in, revenge or any of this. We believe in a modern, urban, developed form of Islam with role for women doctors, women teachers, women lawyers, all these things, of course, within a specific sphere, a designated sphere. Well, you can get, I would not wish to live in the Iranian system in the long run, but you can get a fairly long way with many aspects of social development and legal progress in many ways. Without directly confronting or opposing a program like that.
Okay, yeah, got 3, 4. So please ask short questions. You're allowed to ask only one because we sort of already overshot the time.
One question for Anatol. You said about Anatol being able to create a successful nation state, but he himself had to create the idea of a Turkish nationhood from the bottom up. So don't you think that he faced similar kind of paradigm that early founders of Pakistan faced? Because there was no, when he was trying to create a Turkish state, that it was kind of a derogatory term, and people didn't really want to be known as Turks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
Okay. Right. Yeah.
To what extent would you agree that this retreat from secularism or pluralism is actually a reaction to how Pakistan's portrayed towards itself, and is actually a retreat rather than defining themselves within the Islamic tradition as something which is an offensive label? It's actually retreating to something that's comforting and known, it's actually defensive, becoming more insular and clinging to an identity that they're familiar with, feeling estranged from the global conversation. And it's more of an inward retreat rather than, giving a bold statement that this is who we are, we will define who we are.
Okay.
My question is about when sort of religious parties, say like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or the BJP in India, when they enter the democratic system, or even say the Republicans in America, when they enter the democratic system and even are successful, is it a two-edged sword? Because by entering the sort of the bargains, the compromise, the sort of revivalist, virtuous politics that they espouse, don't they open themselves up to disenchantment, as it could have happened with the way Morsi has been contested even by people who once voted for the Muslim Brotherhood? isn't that it's a big double-edged sword for the democratization of revivalist religion?
Yeah, I mean, and if I may just add a footnote to that, Anatol, because I mean, the striking difference between, say, Egypt or Algeria and Pakistan is, of course, that you don't have any Islamist parties on the horizon which can win electoral majorities of any kind.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, so that really is not the problem in Pakistan.
And a key reason is just what you said. They've had more than 60 years to discredit themselves through endless political deals, horse trading, corruption, patronage. They cannot be seen as oppositionists, and relatively pure in a way that still, for the moment, to a degree, the Muslim Brotherhood can in the Middle East. Absolutely.
Yeah.
My question is, if we want to do a genealogy of the secular, like Talal Saad does, in the Pakistani context, what would the equivalent term be in Urdu or in Arabic? And can we trace this pattern within Islamic intellectual history, or more specifically in South Asia?
That sounds like asking for an idea for a PhD, but I'm sure one of them will. Okay, so let's do it this way. Anatol, you go first, Humeira, and then Christophe will have the last word.
Well, it may not help that if I remember rightly, atheists or secularists that didn't exist at the time, in the Quran are called slaves of the age. Age, of course, age, century, translated into Latin as secular. Secularist. So you start from a pretty bad footing there. Just on Ataturk, I entirely agree. And of course, Ataturk, the Turkish ethnic nationalism in terms of blood was, of course, like every nationalism of fiction. Ataturk himself, like most of the Turkish elites, he was mostly Slav, apparently, and so forth. But it was nonetheless, because of the Ottoman tradition, and of course because of a young Turk and Turkish nationalist tradition which stretched back a generation or so before Ataturk, it was, Renan's famous phrase, of course, to become a nation, you have to have many things in common, but you also have to have forgotten many things. It was much easier to forget all those things in the case of Turkey after the First World War than it could possibly be in the case of Pakistan. But that said, of course, the creation of the bottom, from the bottom up, yes, but it was possible in a way which is, which is not possible in large parts of Turkey, a way which is not possible for the army in Pakistan, to send officers out into the towns to mobilise, create, if you will, stir up this Turkish nationalism. But of course, it was deeply flawed, and it has been largely unsuccessful. At least it's been comparatively successful, but it ultimately failed as far as the Islamists are concerned. And of course, while it got rid of the other ethnic minorities, it has run into perhaps a quarter or more of the population who are Kurdish and who refuse to be assimilated. So after all the bloodshed and horror and all the tremendous rigidity of the state nationalist program, it has at best been only partially successful.
Okay. Well.
So I guess the two questions that I think I may have something to say to. The first is about the idea that perhaps there's a retreat from plurality, and this is partly to do with how Pakistan is represented to Pakistanis themselves. And it's an interesting question to think about. I'm not quite sure I have any clear answers for you because, first of all, there are various things that I think need more explorations. Certainly, I'm not sure there's a clear retreat from plurality in the public sphere over the last 5 or 7 years. There's actually been, at the level of official discourse and at the level in urban places, public places, you will actually see a much more strident discourse of plurality and of valuing plurality. So, for instance, minor things like Christmas trees being put up in Lahore now, and being done very publicly, and being done kind of in the spirit of not just showing to ourselves, but also showing to the rest of the world that we are actually very nice and plural. So I think at an official level, actually there's a conflicted discourse, but one important strand within that discourse is an increasing valuation of plurality. And you also see that actually happening, certainly in the urban centers, through media. The fact that, what is interesting in a place like Pakistan is that people watch news and news programs more than soaps. I mean, really, there's greater viewership for news.
Or rather, the news programs are
the soaps, yes, that too. But there's a lot more, and so, they are the soaps in the sense that, yes, there's little analytical discussion and debate, but at the same time, the discussion and debate that may not have any detailed research behind it, you may not get figures, but you do get these very trenchant positions being kind of battled out in the public sphere of the media. And while it has its problems, one of the things I think it is quite useful for is actually increasing kind of questioning of the value of certain kinds of official positions. And within that, I think that I'm not quite sure, so I'm not sure how to answer your question, but I don't think there's a clear retreat from plurality. And again, I think the killings of the Hazaras, the violence that we are seeing is certainly, so groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, I know that it's suicidal to suggest these things because you are labeled a conspiracy theorist right away. But there are links between ISI, CIA, and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi that remain to be explored. And there's a way in which many of the shrine bombings, etc., in Pakistan, there's a lot of debate about who exactly is doing that. Are they the Pakistani Taliban? Are they groups like Blackwater? Is it being done to sell, middle-class Pakistanis, lower middle-class Pakistanis, or working-class Pakistanis to the idea of a war that they have not bought into? So there is debate. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think it's worth recognizing that people are not convinced that this is a good thing to do, and B, that the groups that are doing this are really kind of the motives that are being given are the motives that people buy into. So there's at least skepticism about the idea of the value of killing Hazaras or the value of bombing shrines. You can't assume that the vast majority of Pakistani population actually support this.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think it's quite useful to actually. Yeah. So when we talk about a retreat from plurality, I'm not quite sure exactly what we're saying here. And also I'm not quite sure what the retreat is to. So you suggested some kind of a comforting Muslimness. But in fact, as I see it, Muslimness is so deeply conflicted that if at all there is a retreat, it will be to something else, but not to Muslimness. That because of the kind of the various levels at which Muslimness is being contested, it's not a comforting place to be at. The question about genealogy of secularism in Muslim intellectual history is quite an interesting one, and actually, one that has quite a lot of takers, and it may be your project, but it is certainly, there's a lot of other people working on this right now. I'm not quite sure, it's not something that I've looked at. I have looked at the fact that there is no clear translation of secularism into Urdu. But people also, for the last century or so, have been using the term secular in Urdu. And so that tells us something different from having a word in Urdu. But the fact that the word itself is being used and it carries slightly different connotations from what the word atheist might carry. And there's actually very many different words for atheism in Urdu. And again, within vernacular languages, so in Pashto and Sindhi and Balochi and Punjabi, I'm not quite sure, but I think it is an interesting project to think about. But I think there are important limits to, so good genealogies also highlight limitations of the kind of work that Asad did. And so Anatol highlighted this about, the idea of sovereignty. If you think about blasphemy laws, and Asad Ali Khan's, Asad Ahmed's work on blasphemy laws in colonial India and in Pakistan, it's quite useful because actually blasphemy laws exist in Britain today as well. It's, they are part, it's not the fact of having something written down as law or having it in the constitution that actually mandates a very clear trajectory that the future will hold, that is absolutely not given. So blasphemy laws are actually, so to speak, on the books in Britain, but they're just not invoked. And so whether a term exists or doesn't exist in Islamic jurisprudence or in a certain language tells us something, but not necessarily a very clear and linear trajectory follows from that.
Okay, Christophe?
Yes.
Very quickly, please.
Yeah, quickly. On this question of whether we have defensive or offensive designs behind these Islamization policies, well, both. Really, it's difficult to disentangle these two dimensions. You know, in the case of Bhutto, obviously, after the 71 trauma, indeed they have to, as you suggested, retreat and regroup vis-à-vis the order that has just broken the country. And same with Zia. He was on the defensive because he had to find some legitimacy. He had a coup, and he had to fall back on Islam. But it's very much offensive also in the sense, and I repeat, Bhutto is the one with Babar, the same Babar who will advise Benazir Bhutto when the Taliban will be selected as their people in Afghanistan, who will support Hekmatyar, Haqqani, Masood, Rabbani against Pashtun nationalists. So he is the first to use Islamists for a jihad or some kind of destabilization of the neighbor. And similarly, Zia will of course use these people not only on the Afghan side but also on the Indian Kashmiri side. So it's very much offensive in that sense. You know, and you can't disentangle both things. Shankar, your question on the mainstreamization in a way and well, they are losing credit of the Islamists. It's a very interesting subject because, of course, the GUI has allied with everybody, almost.
Yes.
What kind of credibility can they retain? This loss of credibility is in itself a problem because that makes space to others. And if you remember well, the Lal Masjid episode, that is a turning point for sure. The Lal Masjid people, when they gave interviews, kept telling everybody, we are against these establishment people, including the GUI, and we are for a real revolution. So here you have Islamism not voting for a party, but having a different project.
Yeah.
And it's one of the challenges, because then you have a special space open to another more radical project if there are followers for that. The last point on retreat of plurality, you know, my feeling is, and it's a rather impressive feeling, that there is a retreat so far as the Shia-Sunni relations are concerned. And the kind of acceptability of the Shias that you could find 15, 20 years ago, when you have intermarriages, when you had no problem with your schoolmaster or the schoolmaster of your kids to be Shia, that is eroding. And it's even worse than anything else, because if you truncate the country vertically from the north to the south according to sectarian lines, then where is the unity on which you can fall back? You can have ethno-linguistic problems. You can certainly deal with Hazaras, pockets of people. But if it becomes an existential threat, then you have to reinvent the project. And that may be the most challenging thing to do. You see this in places like South Punjab. It's not a problem of the periphery, it's a problem of the core. It's a Punjabi problem. What do you do if Punjab is affected? Sorry to end on a bad note.
Well, thank you, Christophe, Humeira, and Anatol. I'm sorry we've sort of run a bit over time. My apologies again for starting late, but I'm sure you'll agree the wait was very much worth it. And please do join me in thanking our panelists today.